I've come up to Observatory Hill this morning to give you a virtual look around the Washburn Observatory, the grounds and the building here on the UW-Madison campus. You can see Lake Mendota out there. We're looking roughly north at this point. And just there in the foreground, you can see a sundial on a pillar, just a garden variety sundial. That sundial more or less marks the site of the old student observatory, which you will see in old pictures of the observatory, but moved off of campus in 1960. In the surroundings, just to the west, you can see the observatory building itself. There it is. We'll go in there in just a moment. And if we look over to the east, another building that's really part of the whole complex is that building there at the end of the sidewalk, which is the former residence of the directors of the Washburn Observatory from 1879 until 1948. The director, whoever was the director of the observatory, lived in that house and of course just walked across the sidewalk here, perhaps shoveling snow as he went to reach the entrance, the east entrance of the observatory. The observatory itself has two entrances, and we will go inside one of them in just a moment when I walk over there. So we'll walk over to the main entrance, which is really the south entrance of the observatory. This is the entrance you want to look for if you were to come here on one of the public observing nights, which have been held on the first and third Wednesday nights of each month since April of 1881. So it's a long and honored tradition here. In recent years, the schedule's expanded in the summer months, June, July, and August. The schedule is every Wednesday night. So the observatory, the public entrance of the observatory is right here. We'll go open the doors and go in. In normal times, this is where we would enter the observatory on a public night with the stairs right here, which will take us up to the dome. This door leads to the first floor of the building, which is currently occupied by the Letters and Science Honors Department. We'll walk through there because there's some things to see, but let's go up first to the telescope. So as I was saying, in normal times, the schedule would be first and third Wednesday nights of the month. If the sky is clear, the public is welcomed to the observatory. You should always check the Washburn Observatory website on the Astronomy Department, the UW Astronomy Department website, in order to confirm that operations are going as normal. Not only do we have extraordinary circumstances like we find ourselves in the early part of 2020, but we also occasionally have a mechanical or structural issue to deal with in the observatory. So always check the website. And here we are. You come into the room. This is the dome that houses the telescope. There is the telescope itself, which I'll talk about in just a moment here. This is the building. This is the original building, the original dome, where the astronomers of Washburn Observatory have worked for going on 140 years now. There are other parts of the building and other things to notice that we'll talk briefly about, though, that we'll also talk about in our lecture about the history of the observatory. But this is the last remaining research instrument up here on Observatory Hill. At a time, once upon a time, there were quite a few. So the business end of the telescope, this is the eyepiece end at the bottom. Right down here. And the telescope is, of course, movable. We have to be able to move it in various directions in order to point in the sky. So this is done entirely manually. This is a telescope that was built in 1878 and became operational in this dome, in this space, in the winter, in January of 1879. Here you can see the eyepiece. We would put an eyepiece in the telescope right here. Right now it just has a plug in there that helps keep the spiders out of the telescope when the telescope isn't being used. And the small telescope above that you can see right up here is the Finder telescope. So that's a 3.5-inch Clark refractor, just a small version of the bigger telescope of our 15.5-inch refractor. One controls the telescope at either at the end of the telescope or at the base of the pier. Right here that holds the telescope up. I'll point up at the mounting in just a moment. The north-south controls, what we call the declination is that coordinate, are right here. You can lock it in place and then do a fine control with this knob right here. And then to go east and west, which in celestial coordinates is called right ascension, you can move the telescope manually, and very often you have to do this, although if you happen to be right here at the base of the telescope, while you can move it across large distances with this convenient wheel, which was a big innovation installed in about 1933, and a big improvement. The old mounting system had ropes at the front and back end of the telescope, and in order to move it a large distance across the room, at least it would require 2 operators to control the telescope, sort of like setting the sails on a sailing ship. Inside the pier is the clock drive of the telescope, which I will start up. This is a weight-driven clock drive, which moves the telescope on its east-west axis, on the polar axis, which is the one you see sloping there from lower right to upper left. That's the east-west axis of motion. That axis of rotation is parallel to the Earth's axis of rotation. So as the clock drive spins, once it's engaged with the telescope, right now it's disengaged. Once it's engaged, it will move the telescope at the same rate that the stars cross the sky, that rate being effectively 1 rotation in 24 hours, a sidereal day, a day as measured by the stars. And the clock drive runs the telescope at exactly that rate, so the telescope itself will make 1 rotation on that axis up there in 24 hours. So right now you can see that the telescope tube is on the west side of the pier, and in 12 hours it would flip itself 180 degrees and be over here on, I'm sorry, that's the east side of the pier. It would flip in 12 hours over here to the west side of the pier, and normally we don't want that to happen. So I'll be sure and turn the clock drive off before I leave. Of course, if we want to observe with the telescope, then we must open up the dome so that we can see out. And the dome mechanism on the Washburn Observatory is very much a homegrown affair. Not that that was unusual in those days, in the 19th century. The slit that opens has been motorized, so I will start it up so that you can see the dome slit opening. It comes in two sections. So you see the upper section moving now. It's being hoisted up on steel cables that actually run along the sides of it, just inside the slit corridor, the slit opening there. And it's pulling that shutter, the upper shutter, onto the far side of the dome on the outside. So if you were outside, you would see this large shutter segment sliding up, and it will end up being parked on the far side of the dome from where the opening is here. After the upper shutter is open, then we can open the lower shutter. I spared you a few minutes of the rather tedious opening of the upper shutter, but that's now done. I'm going to open the lower shutter. So that was pure 1882 technology there, just opening with the rope. But now we would be ready to point the telescope out the dome. So we might do that by tipping the telescope up from the end. And because the telescope is rather long, one quickly has to end up climbing the steps on the scaffolding there to maneuver the telescope like this. And of course to reach the eyepiece as well, to see out the telescope. And so we're now pointed, actually not directly out the dome. I would have to move it just a little bit to have it pointing straight out the dome slit. But that's basically the operation, except that we still need to open the lens cap that covers the objective lens, the 15.5-inch objective lens up at the front of the telescope. So once again, 19th century technology reliably at work for us here in the observatory. So at this point, now we could aim the telescope at something in the evening sky out the slit, and the telescope would, once we engage the clock drive, the telescope would track that object while we observe it through the eyepiece. That's the essence of observing here at this with this 19th century telescope. Of course, we might want to see something that is not in the southwest, where the dome is normally parked, pointing to the southwest. So if we want to observe something that is in some other direction, we have to rotate the telescope dome. So fortunately today, that is motorized. I'm closing up the dome now, and it's nearly, that job is nearly done. But before we're done here in the dome, I wanted to show you the view out of the north door here to the dome, which looks out over Lake Mendota and has a very lovely view. Here you can see the east extension wing of the observatory, where we'll walk in a few minutes, and the balcony wrapping around the dome wall. That was over to the east, and over here to the west you can see the west wing of the building that used to hold the Repsold transit, actually meridian circle instrument over this way. And just out there you can see what's called Chamberlain Rock and two mounds out there, Native American mounds as well. So if you're visiting Washburn Observatory and you have the opportunity to step out here and take in the view, as you can see, it's quite lovely on a good day. I've brought us back downstairs from the dome so that we can take a quick look at the rest of the building. This is normally not open to visitors because it is the offices of the honors program of Letters and Sciences, but it's important still for the observatory's history. Here's the plaque that honors Cadwallader Washburn. There we are. And it's mounted on the pier of the telescope, which we saw upstairs, and it's that large cast iron pier there. This, you can see the edges there tapering upward. This is a masonry pier that holds up the telescope, and the pier also disappears below the floor. We'll walk downstairs and see where that goes into the basement as well. This is looking down towards the west wing of the building where the Repsold Meridian Circle once was. That was all one room. At a certain point, it's now been divided up into offices because the Repsold Circle has been gone for a long time, and that room was converted into a classroom in the 1930s. However, we can walk down here along the eastward, through the eastward corridor this way. This room too has been divided up now into offices. These offices are new, but this room would have been about twice as wide originally, and was originally designated as a clock and computing room in the very early days. But before the observatory was ever really finished, this corridor was added on to the east wing of the building to make a corridor leading into the eastern extension. This cabinet right here is used as a bookshelf. This was one of the original clock cabinets. The observatory clocks were kept in a cabinet to keep them their temperature from shifting too rapidly, and to keep them somewhat protected from changes in humidity. This is was a porch in the early days, and then right through here we have the observatory library, which is a beautiful room and pretty much authentic, pretty much maintained the way that it was in the very early days. Here we have Cadwallader Washburn himself. There he is. The library was a beautifully appointed room. Washburn, of course, paid for all this custom cabinetry, which was the Astronomy Department library. The Astronomy Department library was endowed by Cyrus Woodman, who was a friend and former business partner of Cadwallader Washburn. So it's now called the Woodman Library, but it's no longer this library. The Woodman Library is now, well, it moved in 1958, when the department moved out of this building, the library moved as well over to Sterling Hall. So the shelves were custom designed by the second director of Washburn Observatory, Edward Holden, and the director's office was also in this room, basically in this bay window where you now see a little table and a couple of chairs. That little niche right there was the where the director of the observatory had his desk. Well, if we walk a little bit further through here, we go by the eastern entrance, which is no longer used. It's now just an exit, really. This is the one that empties out in the direction that we first were, out to the east of the building. And then there's a small conference room in here, which was also designated originally as a computing room, a place where the observatory computers, who were human beings, would work. Typically, computers in those days in American observatories, really up until about the 1930s, were typically women who worked in the daytime doing what were largely longhand calculations for data reduction of the astronomical data gathered during the nights of observing. This was also used, in fact mostly used, not so much for computing, although that was its original intention, but it was converted quite early on, again by Edward Holden, into an apartment where the observatory assistants were often housed. One or two observatory assistants, frequently students, would have their lodging right here, and including S.W. Burnham, Sherburne W. Burnham, who we'll talk more about his telescope, really, probably. But Burnham, when he was a guest observer here in the summer of 1881, during the very first research season of the Washburn Observatory, these were his quarters, and a long succession of students, including Joel Stebbins, who would eventually be director of the Washburn Observatory. I've brought us down to the basement of the observatory, just under the east wing at this point, and that was the only place there was a basement before. Most of this is fairly new. Before the rather extensive renovations and restorations of about 2008, this area that we're in right now was basically a crawl space, not anywhere that you could walk through. Had a dirt floor. But right now we're going to walk down through this new corridor in order to get back to the pier of the telescope. But one of the reasons I'm bringing us this way is to show the display case that we have here with a few historical artifacts from the early days of the observatory, including the only remnant of the Watson Solar Observatory, the stone that used to be mounted over the door, and some antique calculating tools, and the micrometer from the Repsold meridian circle that I've mentioned a few times, and that you'll see in our history of the observatory lecture, and then a few historic photographs, which you can also find in that lecture, as well as some artifacts from the early days of photoelectric photometry, which was the technology that was perfected here for astronomical uses. There's one of the early handmade photoelectric tubes, that silvery thing right there. We'll walk now through the door out of this section of the basement and into the central section. That masonry wall that you see before you is actually the base of the telescope pier, which comes down here and goes then even below ground level here in the basement, and goes up through the floor, our ceiling, the floor above us, and then through the floor of the observatory dome as well, and ends up with that cast iron pier that we actually see with the telescope mounting on top of there. So this is the the true foundations of the Washburn Observatory here, and we're also just outside now. The wall, this thick wall, is actually the stone wall that holds up the dome of the observatory. So we will go back upstairs now and finish up by a quick look around the outside of the building. Here we are again outside the main entrance, the south entrance of the observatory, and walking westward just to take a quick look here really at the west wing of the building, of the original building. There was inside this wing of the building the Meridian Circle, the Repsold Meridian Circle telescope. For most of the years that the observatory had use for one of those instruments until about the 1930s. You can tell, if you look carefully, what's going on there. The shutter that is in between the two windows is rather narrow and tall and goes right up to the roof line and actually continues through the modern roof line where it's been roofed over, and there's a similar shutter on the north side as well. So they would open up 4 sets of shutters on the south side, the north side, and on the 2 sloping sides of the roof, the roof of the building, so that the Meridian Circle inside this west wing of the building could have a clear view of the sky from north to south all the way through the local meridian. And here we are now around the north side of the observatory building with the dome, the main dome there, and you can see the balcony where we were just a few minutes ago looking out over the lake. So this is the, you can see here the basic architecture of the building, the dome in the middle, the west wing for the Meridian Circle, the east wing for what was originally designated as a computing and clock room, and those constitute what we often call a Berlin-style observatory, as we'll talk about in our discussions of the history of observatory buildings. And then on to the east wing was added this extension, which you can see there, that made room for the library and the full basement of the observatory that we just walked through. So remember, under normal circumstances, the observatory is open to the public on the first and third Wednesday nights of each month if the sky is clear, and in the summer months every Wednesday night. But check the astronomy department website for details on the observatory's operations.